Hello everyone, and welcome back to Form and Function. I'm your host Natalie, and today we will be learning about a disease unfamiliar to most people and underdiagnosed. This disease is known as Hereditary Hemorrhagic Telangiectasia, or HHT for short. In order to best acquaint ourselves with HHT, we will be sitting down with Telangiectasia, or HHT for short. In order to best acquaint ourselves with HHT, we will be sitting down with Dennis Wren, who is not only knowledgeable about this disease, but is also an HHT patient himself. We will be asking him questions about the cardiovascular system, how HHT disrupts homeostasis, and how it is inherited. So before we begin, let's learn a little bit more about Dennis and his experience with HHT. Hello, Dennis.
Hello, Natalie. Thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to get to talk to your listeners about hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. And just to start, let's break down the name to make it a little less intimidating. It can definitely be a mouthful at first. Let's start with hereditary, obviously meaning that it is passed down through genetics from one generation to the next. Hemorrhagic meaning that something can hemorrhage and bleed. And telangiectasia refers to the actual structures that are formed, and those are the ones that do actually bleed. These structures are the results of malformed capillary beds, which we will describe later.
So before we get into the anatomy and physiology of HHT, we would like to ask you a few questions about yourself. How old are you now, and how old were you when you first found out you had HHT?
Absolutely. So I'm 31 years old right now, and I was about 12 or 13 when I first started experiencing nosebleeds associated with HHT, and those only got actually much worse into my early 20s. The HHT diagnosis is in my family, and it actually began when my maternal aunt was officially diagnosed with HHT through genetic testing. And HHT being an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, it means that there's a good chance, actually, our offspring will inherit this disorder. Knowing this, we were able to trace the symptoms of nosebleeds, or also known as epistaxis, through my family to my mom, also having the same symptoms, and then inherited through my maternal grandmother, who actually was diagnosed with HHT post-mortem. With HHT being an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, it can actually be diagnosed on a scale called the Curacao scale. And I won't get too much into that, but basically the scale entails that there are four criteria. And if 3 of those criteria are met by a single individual, then you can be considered symptomatically diagnosed with HHT. One of these criteria being a first-degree relative that has the disease, and the other ones being symptoms of said disease, such as the presence of those telangiectasia and also the nosebleeds or epistaxis. It became pretty apparent all at once that HHT ran pretty prominently through my family, and I would say it's also important to note that HHT symptoms can vary by person to person and even vary within families. For example, my sister is very different than me with her HHT. She is also diagnosed with it, but does not suffer from daily nosebleeds. She rarely gets them. I was medically diagnosed, though earlier this year, when I visited University of Utah's HHT Center of Excellence, I was able to see a specialist that studies that disease.
Thank you, Dennis. We appreciate that information. So now I would also like to ask, how does HHT affect your daily life?
Thank you for that question. As I said already, one of the primary symptoms of HHT is epistaxis, also known as nosebleeds. And while that doesn't seem like the absolute worst possible symptom that a disease can manifest, it actually can occur rather frequently, often up to 1 or 2 times a day, and does happen completely uncontrollably. And of course, I would personally like to say it always happens at the most inopportune of times. As some of our listeners may know, I actually had a nosebleed during one of our last exams, and I was very thankful for Dr. Green, who continued to run me tissues so that I could finish taking that exam and not have to walk out. So when it can happen at times like that, I would say it goes beyond an inconvenience. These nosebleeds, though, can vary in severity. They can be anything but of spotting to a 1-hour-long ordeal of both sides of my nose bleeding, and that is pretty common for a lot of HHT patients. Now, nosebleeds are definitely not the only symptom or even daily symptom that can be experienced with HHT. Some people don't experience the nosebleeds, but experience other such types of bleeds, such as on the tongue, the lip, or even more rarely, but can happen on the surface of the skin. These are telangiectasia that develop in those places as well that are capable of bleeding. But that's what's important to know, is that the same structure that is causing the nosebleeds is the same structure that is causing the bleeds in the lips, the tongue, or the skin.
Okay, now that we've gotten to learn a little bit more about you and this disease, Dennis, let's talk about the cardiovascular system that it affects.
As a lot of us do know, the cardiovascular system acts as like a pump and filter for the blood in our bodies. Blood flows in through the veins, becomes oxygenated and flows out through the arteries. Also, another major component of the cardiovascular system are the capillary beds. And these form a type of intersection between veins and arteries. They can be thought of as like a web-like structure or a web-like network of small vessels that are the site of oxygen diffusion and nutrient exchange, and also filtering of blood. These exist all over the human body to help perform this function.
So, Dennis, as we understand, HHT is a disruption of this cardiovascular system. Is that correct?
Yes. So HHT definitely primarily disrupts the cardiovascular system in the human body. And it does so by having those aforementioned capillary beds that we talked about. So a fully functional capillary bed can be thought as like an interconnected web between the veins and the arteries. Think of it as some maybe interconnected hairs that are lying flat and connected to each other to help increase surface area. That is how essentially a properly functioning capillary bed would appear. Now, in a patient with AD, the process that's used to produce these capillary beds, known as angiogenesis, does not terminate at the correct point. And so these capillary beds actually overproduce. And what results is, instead of some interlocked hairs, they essentially produce what you could imagine to be like a matted pile of hair. And that no longer serves the same function that they are supposed to. These matted structures are extremely fragile and susceptible to rupturing. And this is what occurs in the nose that can lead to nosebleeds, but it also is something that can occur in other places in the body. It can happen in the brain, it can happen in the lungs, it could also happen in the GI tract. For us, I'd like to take a bit of a focus on the lungs, because as I discussed earlier, using that pump and filter analogy for the lungs, the capillary beds is actually one place the capillary beds in the lungs is actually one place where they are used as a filter. And if you have a misformed capillary bed in the lungs, you essentially have a hole in that filter, and can actually prevent filtering of blood in a specific location. This type of telangiectasia is actually called an AVM, an arteriovenous malformation, also described as shunting, because of the idea that instead of having a filtered area, it is simply just one shunt where the blood flows through without being filtered. I actually personally have a small AVM in my lung that does require some special considerations.
Wow, so these structures really disrupt the homeostasis of the cardiovascular system. Are there any treatments available?
So there are. There is no cure for HHT, but there definitely are treatments that treat the symptoms of HHT. And for those, I'd like to focus on the treatments of the AVMs in the lungs and the treatment of the telangiectasia that occur in the nose and cause nosebleed. As scary as an AVM in the lung sounds, the procedure now is simple for removing it. As long as it is caught early and taken care of, there's really not a lot of risk that comes from it. What they do is, in this process, is they take an endoscopy down through the lung, and they essentially tie off what I called the shunting part, the part that's not filtering. It's no longer serving a purpose to begin with. It's a straight shot. So they tie that off so it no longer exists, and eventually those blood vessels just sort of die off, and the procedure and the process just continues. The procedure for the nose can actually be a little bit more complicated. It does require what they call a bilateral coblation and laser coagulation. Now, that can definitely sound like a mouthful, but the bilateral endoscopic part just means they go up through your nose, both sides, and they use a laser to coagulate any of the areas inside of the nose. The coblation part is the part that's a bit more complex. It involves them running a plasma matrix over the intramembrane of the nose. It's not very important to know what that is, but essentially what it does is it shrinks these telangiectasia. It shrinks them down until they are no longer able to bleed and they no longer really exist. The problem with any of these types of treatments in this case is you are treating the symptoms of a genetic disorder. Your body continues to make new capillaries constantly. And so if you have HHT, your body always runs the risk of making capillaries that are not proper, that are not correct. So any treatment that is done to HHT is considered temporary. At this point, there is no cure. Now, there is also some more severe procedures available to treat nosebleeds symptoms for people that have had poor success or more reoccurring need for the laser surgery. And this procedure is called Young's procedure. And essentially what they do, like I said, it sounds fairly drastic, is they go in and they seal off your nose and you no longer breathe through your nose. This, however, does in turn reduce blood flow to your nose, and so you eventually, in the long run, no longer get nosebleeds.
Interesting. So, are there any populations you know of that this disease is more prevalent?
Okay, I mean, so given that HHT is, like I said, an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, and there's always that 50-50% chance that offspring will have it, so really any community that is prevalent or tends to, as the interbreed, it increases its prevalence. For example, there is a high prevalence of it in some Amish communities in Utah. That being given to the fact that most Amish people would tend to marry and procreate with other Amish Amish people. And so if you have an autosomal dominant genetic disorder that is already prevalent in the population, and that population is staying closed off, then there's a higher incidence of it occurring. This can act sex disease in Jewish people, which is also an autosomal dominant genetic disorder. So again, culturally, it tends to run more prevalently through that particular population.
Interesting. Well, that concludes our discussion of HHT. We would like to give a huge thank you to explain this disease to us today.
And I really appreciate you guys having me today. I always get to appreciate a chance to talk about HHT. The fact about HHT as well, it is a rare disorder, and it is believed to affect about 1 in 10,000 people. It's also considered a highly underdiagnosed disorder, meaning that most of the people with HHT don't know that they actually have HHT. So that 1 in 10,000 is actually estimated to be closer to about 1 in 5,000. So any chance that I get to talk about this disease and maybe bring some sort of awareness to it, I always appreciate it. Maybe there's someone out there listening today that will discover that what's been going on in their family and they could get some answers from it. So thank you, and I really appreciate you having me today.
All right, so today we covered the cardiovascular system, how HHT disrupts homeostasis, and how it is inherited.